Have you ever looked at someone and realized they're making 10, maybe 20 times more money than you, and you just can't figure out how that gap even exists? Not because they're smarter than you, not because they're grinding 20 times harder, they're just somehow playing an entirely different game. I remember asking myself that exact question years ago, sitting across from one of my mentors during a quiet conversation that would change everything. We were talking about a guy online, one of those names you'd recognize instantly if I said it out loud. I asked, half joking, "What do you think he really makes?" My mentor didn't even hesitate. He said, on a slow month, probably $600,000 or $700,000. I laughed at first. Then I stopped laughing because this was around 2014 or 2015, and at that time, numbers like that didn't exist anywhere near my reality, not even close. That question stayed with me for months, gnawing at me. How does someone even arrive at that level? What did they know that I don't? What I eventually discovered didn't just change my income, it completely rewired how I see money, power, and what's actually possible in this world. You can turn what you currently make in a year into what you make in a month. And when that truly clicks, when you internalize what that actually means, it doesn't just add zeros to your bank account, it fundamentally changes how you think, how you move, and how you build your entire life. This wasn't some cute motivational phrase I picked up at a weekend seminar. This was one of the most violent financial awakenings of my life. In fact, it was the very first real breakthrough I ever had with money, and it still ranks in my top 3 most important realizations to this day. I remember exactly when it happened. Late 1990s. I was broke, frustrated, and desperately searching for answers anywhere I could find them. That's when I picked up a book most of you have probably heard of, Rich Dad, Poor Dad. When I read it, something inside me snapped into place. It felt like fog lifting off a lake at sunrise, like I'd been staring at money my whole life through frosted glass, and suddenly everything became crystal clear. I could finally see the game for what it was. If I had to reduce that entire book to one sentence, it would be this: wealth is built by creating income-producing assets. That's it, nothing more complicated than that. The reason most men stay broke their entire lives isn't laziness, it's not lack of effort or discipline, it's that they themselves are the only thing producing money in their lives. When they stop working, the income stops flowing. When they rest, the cash flow ends. When they take a vacation, everything halts. Machiavelli warned about this centuries ago when he wrote that a man who depends entirely on his own labor is always at the mercy of circumstance. Power, he said, belongs to those who build structures that outlive effort. The wealthy understand this instinctively. They don't chase income the way most people do, running after it like it's something to catch. They accumulate assets first, and income follows them naturally, inevitably. One modern thinker put it cleanly: income follows assets the way a shadow follows a body. You don't chase the shadow around trying to grab it. You move the body and the shadow moves with you. Here's where it starts to sound crazy, and I know exactly how this is going to land when you first hear it. It is easier to make $1 million in a month than it is to make $1 million in a year. It's easier to make $1 million in a week than $1 million in a month. Easier in a day than a week. Easier in an hour than a day. That sounds absolutely insane, maybe even offensive, until you understand leverage. And before you roll your eyes and dismiss this as hype or exaggeration, understand something crucial. I'm not repeating something I heard at a conference or read in a book. I'm telling you how I actually live. I've done all of those things multiple times, and Machiavelli would nod at this because he understood something most men never learn in their entire lives. Power concentrates. It does not distribute evenly over time. The strong get stronger. The leveraged get more leveraged. That's how the world actually works, whether you like it or not. So how do I prove this without just throwing theory at you? Years ago, I was on a long flight across the country, sitting next to a young engineer who worked in applied physics. We ended up talking for hours about everything under the sun. At one point, I asked him what principle governed everything he studied in his field. He smiled and said something I never forgot. He said, all true principles repeat themselves across domains. In other words, if something works in one arena, it must work in another. If it doesn't transfer, it wasn't really a principle to begin with. Machiavelli taught the same idea in political terms. The laws of power don't change just because the stage does. A law that governs warfare also governs business. A law that governs physics also governs wealth. The game changes, but the rules stay the same. So let's borrow a principle from movement and apply it to money. Imagine two men racing across a distance. One runs on foot, the other rides a bicycle. The man on the bike goes farther, faster, and uses way less energy doing it. His heart rate is lower. He's not even sweating. Now give them both bikes and one of them gets a car. Same outcome. The car wins every single time. Upgrade again to a plane, then a jet, then a rocket. Every single time, the man with leverage covers more distance with less effort. The lesson is uncomfortable, but it's brutally simple. Men who make vastly more money than you are not outworking you. They're not more disciplined. They're not suffering more or sacrificing more. They're out-leveraging you. They're not sprinting harder down the same road. They changed vehicles entirely, and most people never even realize this is happening. Here's the tragedy that keeps most men stuck forever. Most men were trained from childhood to respect small progress over long periods. Grind it out, endure the pain, stay patient, stay in your lane, work your way up slowly. Machiavelli would call this conditioning useful for rulers, not for builders, because if you keep men focused on slow, incremental steps, they never ask the dangerous question: how do I leap? How do I compress time?
How do I move faster than the system expects? Leveraged work will always dominate laborious work. It produces more results, costs less energy, and compounds faster over time. Yet most people never even look for leverage. They ask what it costs up front. They never ask what it costs to live without it for the next 10 years. They never calculate the opportunity cost of staying small. So before we go any further, I want you to pause and reflect honestly. Have you been trying to win by running harder or by changing vehicles? If this idea hits you somewhere deep, drop a comment right now with 1 or 2 words that capture it. Something simple like leverage or different game or wake-up call. Lock the thought in, make it real, because once you understand that leverage changes outcomes, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why doesn't everyone use it? Why do so many men keep running on foot when better vehicles clearly exist all around them? The answer sits deeper than money. It lives in how people are taught to think from the time they're children. After that flight conversation years ago, the one with the engineer, I couldn't stop replaying what he said in my head. If a principle is true, it must hold everywhere. If it doesn't transfer across domains, it isn't actually a principle. Machiavelli built his entire worldview on this idea. He studied war, politics, and human behavior not as separate games with separate rules, but as mirrors of the same underlying structure. Once you see that, you start noticing patterns everywhere you look. I remember reading a book years later about innovation and creative dominance, focused on how certain leaders seem to bend reality while others just follow along. One example that stuck with me wasn't about technology at all. It was about perspective and how you see the world. The author explained how the most disruptive thinkers don't invent things from nothing. They don't start from scratch. They recombine ideas from unrelated fields. They steal principles from one arena and weaponize them in another. They see a pattern in nature and apply it to business. They see a strategy in chess and apply it to negotiation. Machiavelli did this in reverse, pulling lessons from ancient Rome and applying them to Renaissance politics. Same move, different stage. Same principle, different domain. That's why the transportation metaphor matters so much. It isn't cute, it isn't motivational fluff designed to make you feel good. It's structural, it's mathematical. If one man runs and another rides, the rider wins. If both ride and one drives, the driver wins. If both drive and one flies, the one who flies wins. Distance, speed, and effort are not equalized by fairness or good intentions. They're determined by leverage. Nature doesn't care how hard you try or how much you suffer. It rewards efficiency. It rewards intelligent design. Power works exactly the same way. Machiavelli wrote that fortune favors those who know how to bend conditions to their will, not those who submit to them. The man who insists on fairness will always lose to the man who understands force multipliers. That's not cynical, that's just reality. Here's where most people short-circuit when they hear this. They hear it and immediately think, that's not fair. Exactly, you're right. Power has never been fair. Wealth has never been fair. Fairness is a moral concept that makes you feel good. Money is a mechanical system that doesn't care about your feelings. The marketplace doesn't reward exhaustion or suffering. It rewards positioning. It rewards being in the right place with the right vehicle. When someone makes 10 times more than you, it's not because they're 10 times more virtuous or 10 times more disciplined. It's because they've placed themselves in a position where effort scales instead of caps. They changed the system they're operating inside of. They upgraded their vehicle while you were still trying to run faster. But conditioning runs deep. From the time you were young, you were trained to associate progress with small, steady steps. Show up on time, try harder, stay longer, wait your turn, respect the process. That programming works perfectly if the goal is obedience and predictability. It works terribly if the goal is freedom and expansion. Machiavelli warned that systems survive by convincing people that slow suffering is noble. Once men internalize that belief, once they wear it like a badge of honor, they stop searching for exits. They stop asking dangerous questions like, how do I compress time? How do I achieve in 1 year what takes others 10? How do I play a completely different game? This is why leveraged work scares people at a deep level. It exposes a painful truth that most people don't want to face. If leverage exists, if it's real and accessible, then grinding harder was never the solution. And that's a hard pill to swallow, because many men have built their entire identity around effort. They take pride in exhaustion. They wear burnout like a Purple Heart. So when you suggest leverage, when you show them a faster path, they don't argue logically, they react emotionally. They say things like, leverage costs money I don't have, or I don't have time to learn that right now, or that sounds risky and unstable. What they're really saying underneath all of that is, if this is true, then I've been playing the wrong game my whole life, and that's terrifying to admit. Here's the question they never ask themselves, the one that actually matters. What is it costing you to not have leverage? What is the real price of staying exactly where you are for another 5 years, another decade, another lifetime?
Machiavelli would say that delay is one of fortune's favorite traps. Men wait for perfect certainty, for all the lights to turn green. Meanwhile, power moves while they hesitate. Learning leverage always feels expensive up front because it forces you to slow down in a world that worships constant motion. But running in the wrong direction faster doesn't get you anywhere meaningful. Sometimes the most aggressive move you can make is to stop, think clearly, and reposition yourself entirely. Most people say they don't have time to learn leverage. That excuse only works once. A year later, it becomes negligence. You can learn almost anything in 12 months if your survival actually depends on it. The truth is, people don't avoid leverage because it's complicated or hard to understand. They avoid it because it requires admitting that effort alone won't save them. And once you admit that, once you really see it, you're responsible for changing. You can't unsee it and stay innocent. So the real fork in the road looks like this. You can keep doing exactly what you've always done, working harder, upgrading your running shoes, and hoping something magically changes. Or you can pause long enough to acquire a new vehicle. Pay for leverage if you have to. Learn how to use it even if it's uncomfortable at first. Because once you understand this principle, you can't unsee it, and staying in the same place becomes a conscious decision, not an accident of circumstance. Before we move on, I want you to check in with yourself honestly. Do you agree with this, or does it make you uncomfortable? Both reactions matter. Both tell you something important. Drop a comment with one word that captures how this landed for you. Something like truth, resistance, or awakening. Your response tells you more about where you actually are than you might think.
because now we're going to break down exactly where money actually comes from, why most effort is capped by design, and how wealth only begins once you cross a specific, invisible line that most people never even see. Once you accept that leverage matters more than raw effort, the next question becomes obvious. Where exactly does leverage come from? This is where most men get deeply confused because they've been taught the wrong measuring stick their entire lives. They believe that if they deliver more value, they should automatically be paid more money. Sounds logical, it's also mostly false. More value at the wrong level doesn't create exponential income, it just creates more exhaustion and burnout. Machiavelli warned about this without using modern language when he observed that men who serve well are often rewarded with more service, not more power. They get more responsibility, more work, more expectations, but not more freedom or wealth. Value is not flat, it's stacked in layers. There are levels to value, and they are not equal. If you don't understand which level you're operating on right now, you can work yourself into the ground and still stay stuck at the same income for decades. The lowest level is implementation. This is where most people live their entire lives. On this level, you trade your physical effort multiplied by time for money. You lift, carry, fix, type, drive, assemble, clean, build. Nothing wrong with honest work, but understand the mathematical limitation built into this model. Your body is a physical resource. Time is a finite resource. Multiply two limited things together and you will always get a limited result. That's not an opinion or a judgment, that's just math. That's just reality staring you in the face. This is what it means to be running financially. You only move forward when you're physically moving. You only earn when you're present and working. When you want more money, the only lever you know how to pull is more hours, more effort, more physical strain. When that stops working, when you hit the ceiling, you buy better running shoes. You switch jobs hoping for a raise. You get another certification. You go back to school for another degree. Same model, same ceiling, same trap. Machiavelli would call this dependence. A man dependent entirely on his own labor has no margin, no leverage, and no protection from fortune when it turns against him. The next level up is unification. This is where you manage people instead of doing everything yourself. Here, you're using organization, coordination, and delegation instead of just your own two hands. Instead of one person's effort, you're multiplying effort through others. This is leverage by delegation, and yes, it's better than implementation. Income rises, the range expands. You might go from barely surviving to doing fairly well, maybe even comfortable, but there's still a ceiling hovering above you. You're still limited by how many people you can manage and how much time you can spend overseeing them. You're no longer running on foot, but you're still pedaling a bike. You still have to show up. You still have to maintain the system. This is where many people stop and think they've made it. They think they've won the game. Machiavelli would say they've only secured a minor post, not sovereignty. They become a manager, not a ruler. A critical mindset shift happens right here, and it's one you should adopt immediately if you haven't already. Floors matter infinitely more than ceilings. You want a minimum income that you refuse to drop below, not a maximum that you're afraid to exceed. Most people do the exact opposite. They set invisible ceilings on themselves because deep down they don't believe they're allowed to rise past a certain point. They don't believe someone like them deserves to make that much money. Now here's the line most people never cross in their entire lives. Above this line, real wealth actually begins. The next level is communication. This is where income finally detaches from physical effort. At this level, you use words and ideas to create value. And that sounds strange to people who've been taught that wheel work is hard, sweaty, and painful. They ask, how can talking make more money than lifting bricks or driving trucks 12 hours a day? Because money doesn't pay for difficulty or suffering. It pays for impact. It pays for reach. It pays for influence. Machiavelli understood this perfectly when he wrote that whoever controls perception controls reality itself. Communication moves people, it shapes belief, it coordinates action at massive scale. That's why a single speech can mobilize entire nations while 1,000 laborers remain completely replaceable. Language is not physical, it's psychological, and psychology scales infinitely in ways that physical labor never can. Money itself proves this principle. There is nothing physically backing modern currency. No gold, no silver, no tangible asset. It has value purely because we collectively believe the message printed on it. Belief and language are invisible forces, and invisible forces move the world. Think about it clearly. Actors, writers, speakers, leaders, negotiators, and persuaders earn vastly more than manual laborers, not because they work harder or suffer more, because their words move more people. Even when the message is fictional, the money is real. So imagine the leverage when the message actually helps people, teaches them something valuable, or transforms how they see the world.
The tragedy is that most people were trained early in life not to speak up. Be quiet, don't interrupt, don't stand out. Talking gets you in trouble. Over time, that conditioning hardens into permanent identity. I'm not a communicator. I'm not good with words. That single belief alone has cost people absolute fortunes over the course of their lives. Above communication sits the highest level, imagination. This is where ideas, capital, and vision combine into something unstoppable. Here, money is used to create more money. Systems are designed, structures are built that outlive you. This is where dynasties are formed, where generational wealth is created. Machiavelli described this as the domain of founders and rulers, not servants or employees. At this level, even what once felt like extraordinary income starts to look small because your entire perspective has fundamentally changed. Limits dissolve completely when imagination replaces obedience. And here's the uncomfortable truth that nobody wants to say out loud. The only real constraints at this level live entirely in your mind. They are self-imposed breaks. They're stories you absorbed early in life about who you're allowed to be, how far you're allowed to go, and what's realistic for someone like you with your background. Once those mental barriers dissolve, once you stop believing them, ceilings vanish into thin air. Before we move on, I want you to pause and reflect honestly on this framework. Where have you been operating most of your life? Implementation, management, or communication? Drop a comment with one word that represents the level you're currently on, not where you want to be someday, where you actually are right now. That honesty matters more than you know. Once you understand the top level of value, imagination, something strange happens that nobody warns you about. Numbers that once felt massive suddenly feel small, not because you've become greedy or lost your values, but because your entire frame of reference has expanded. I remember a period years ago when I thought I had figured money out completely. I was making more in a month than anyone around me. My expenses were low, my lifestyle felt elevated and comfortable. I was convinced I had finally arrived at the destination. Then I attended a private wealth event and shared my progress with one of the senior speakers there. He listened politely, nodded, and said something that hit me like a physical slap. He said, "You're doing well, but you're standing right before a much bigger door, and you don't even see it yet." I felt offended for about 10 seconds. Then I felt intensely curious. That curiosity completely changed my life and my trajectory. Machiavelli would describe that moment as the collapse of a false ceiling. He warned that men often mistake temporary comfort for true conquest. They celebrate too early and stop growing. Imagination is dangerous because it exposes how completely artificial your limits really are. At this level, money is no longer tied to effort or even communication alone. It's tied to vision, structure, and capital movement. You're no longer asking, "How do I earn more?" You're asking a completely different question. What can I build that earns without me? What system can I create that generates income while I sleep? That question separates earners from architects. That question separates employees from empire builders.
This is also where recession talk stops mattering in the way it used to. Men operating above this line don't participate in economic downturns the same way everyone else does, not because they're immune to reality, but because they're aggressive when others freeze in fear. Machiavelli taught that fortune favors decisiveness, especially during chaos and uncertainty. While others pull back and hide, the imaginative expand. They acquire assets at discounts. They position themselves for the recovery. They move capital where fear has created opportunity. That's why the largest fortunes in history are often built during unstable times, not stable ones. Crisis reveals who understands leverage and who doesn't. Here's the shift most people never make in their entire lives. They think progress comes from choice. Choice feels flexible and safe, but choice leaves exits open. Decision is completely different. To decide means to cut off alternatives entirely. Machiavelli was brutally blunt about this. Hesitation breeds weakness and invites disaster. Once a man truly decides who he will become, circumstances begin to rearrange themselves around that certainty. Excuses lose their power. External obstacles shrink. The only thing left is execution. And this is where people start reaching for identity-based excuses. Gender, race, background, industry, geography, none of them actually hold up under scrutiny. History is absolutely full of men and women who rose in hostile conditions because they refused to internalize the limits around them. The prison is not the environment. The prison is the interpretation of it. When you believe a boundary exists outside you, you act constrained. When you realize it exists only inside you, in your mind, you dissolve it instantly. Now let's get practical instead of staying theoretical. When people see the highest levels of wealth, they often assume you have to be a global celebrity, an actor, a singer, a superstar athlete. But those paths are rare and fragile. They rely on youth, timing, and external approval from gatekeepers. Machiavelli would never advise building power on something you fundamentally don't control. The more reliable path is communication, writing, teaching, speaking, publishing, reporting back to the marketplace what you've learned and tested in the real world. I didn't start out with some grand master plan. I started by sharing ideas that helped me. Years ago, I wrote a book without knowing if anyone would care or read it. I invested in learning how to distribute it properly, not because I was special or talented, but because I understood leverage. When it sold more than expected, something clicked. The book wasn't the asset, the message was the asset. The same thing happened later with video and online content. I spoke for years before I ever made a single dollar from it. When monetization finally entered the picture, it compounded decades of practice almost overnight. That's how leverage works in real life. It looks painfully slow until suddenly it isn't. Here's what most people completely miss. You don't get paid for how hard something is. You don't get paid for how much you suffered. You get paid for how many people it reaches and how deeply it moves them or helps them. Communication sits at the intersection of thinking and influence. You can speak without thinking, but you cannot think clearly without words. The men who refine their thinking refine their language. The men who refine their language refine their income. This is not motivational theory. This is mechanical reality. So here's the simplest formula I know for building leverage through communication. Read more than you consume passively. Think more than you react emotionally. Speak about what you've actually tested, not theories. Write what you've learned from real experience. Share it consistently over time without quitting. Ideas compound the exact same way capital does in an investment account. And when you operate from imagination instead of pure labor, yearly income collapses into months, sometimes even faster than you expect. Before we close, I want you to reflect honestly one final time. What is one belief about money or success that you now realize was artificially limiting you? Drop it in the comments, even if it's uncomfortable to admit. Or if you want something simpler, comment 1 or 2 words like no ceiling or decided or imagination. Say it publicly where others can see it. That matters more than you think. And if this way of thinking resonates with you deeply, subscribe and join a growing community of men who are completely done confusing effort with progress, who are learning to think strategically, speak deliberately, and build leverage that actually lasts. This isn't about hype or motivation. This is about structure, systems, and seeing the world as it truly is. And once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it ever again.